Welcome to Flip Video 3.2. We are going to take a look at how culture is regionalized, how we actually define regions using culture. But before we do, there's just one thing I forgot to include on the last flipped video, so we just flip back to your notes for just a second. This is pretty intuitive, but it's just helpful to give some examples here. We mentioned already that pop culture is diffused primarily through technology, but more specifically, the technology here, we're talking about TVs and internet. And so the U.S. has the largest concentration of TVs anywhere in the world. The US, Japan, Canada, and Western Europe have the largest distribution of internet access in the world. Well, these things make sense for several reasons. Of course, these are some of the most developed countries of the world. And moreover, that then makes sense why pop culture is often originating in these places, because if they have the means through which the pop culture or the practice itself can be diffused, then that means that the people of these places are often going to be the largest practitioners and the consumers of that culture. So just a little example to further help us understand both why pop culture originates in MDCs and why pop culture is primarily found in many places across MDCs. Okay, so how's culture regionalized? Where culture comes from. Culture comes and is formed by customs as opposed to habits. Habits are things that are an individual, a repetitive act that you yourself do. So let's say, for example, you got a habit where you come home from school and you make yourself a massive meal because you don't like the school food. That's just your choice. That's an individual habit that you choose to do. Or perhaps you have the awesome habit of doing your homework on as soon as it's assigned or whatever. That's a specific thing about, that's a habit that you yourself are doing. In contrast, a custom is something, it's a repetitive act of a group of people, and it's performed to the extent that it becomes an actual characteristic of the group. It kind of defines that group. So, for example, in one sense, you could argue that in the United States we've got customs about brushing teeth in the morning and at night, or about taking a shower on a daily basis, or customs, maybe there's customs TV, and TV watching is a component, sadly, I guess, in our culture of a custom. In an Islamic country, one of the customs, or in an Islamic culture, I should say in general, a custom would be praying 5 times a day. That's not just an individual choice, that's truly a custom associated with the faith. So habits are individual, but customs really define a group, and they're practiced by a group, so much so that the group's existence is really defined by that. And not only are customs something that you actively choose to do, but it's also defined by what you're not allowed to do or what you choose actively not to do. And this is a reference to those taboos that we mentioned already, which are the restrictions on behaviors that are imposed by social customs. So what's considered unacceptable in that particular culture. Not the greatest map, but it suffices here. This is showing us meat consumption per capita, and if you hone in on the pink, which is representation of pork, you'll see here in the Middle East that there's very, very low pork consumption because it's considered taboo by the Islamic faith. So logically, in the areas where the Islamic faith is most prevalent, you will not see large-scale consumption of meat. That would be a custom here. Similarly, this is actually just kind of a fun, or well, I guess not fun, but interesting example again of customs. And you can see here world alcohol consumption. Exact same example, but this time with alcohol. Alcohol is considered taboo also in the Islamic faith. So you see again that there's a very low alcohol consumption here. And then this one down here is just the type of alcohol by region, the one that people tend to drink the most. So sort of more, again, this is a little bit of a generalization here, but just customs. Of course, beer, as you notice, is prevalent in areas where wheat and barley can be grown. That's where beer is coming from. And in contrast, over here in Asia, you see it's primarily spirits because much of the alcohol is derived from rice. So just generally speaking, we're talking about the differences here between individual choices versus large-scale patterns of behavior that can then be described along the lines of customs. Now let's talk about culture, how we're actually going to scale this up. So if we're talking about regions of culture, we're talking about how these, looking at different scales of analysis. We're looking at individual and individual and small scale cultural practices and all the way up to global cultural practices. So we're analyzing this at different scales. We're changing our scale of analysis. Culture starts with cultural traits. So it's a single component of a culture. It's a building block of a culture. Art, language, religion, clothing, architecture, views on money, government, right? These are all individual little building blocks. And I'm going to show you a little pictorial representation here. So think of those little mini blocks. Each one of those cultural traits are just the single components of the culture. When those culture traits are combined, that's called a cultural complex, when we combine several of those traits together. and those several different traits are somehow descriptive of a society's behavior or its activities. Think of it in this way. Think of like that here in, if we're describing the cultural complex of DC, maybe one of those culture traits, too far, would be go-go. Maybe one of those culture traits would be the monuments. Maybe one of the culture traits would be what else of these? This is terrible. I can't think of another example. Maybe you'd argue even like the fashion. Largely, if you go down to K Street area, you're looking at all suits, right? So these are just the different cultural traits. When we put those together, we're starting to get a cultural complex, things that are going to be descriptive of a larger group of people. In many ways, we're getting close to that cultural complex is pretty close to the general definition that you and I probably likely just use in day-to-day existence for what a culture is, because those are just the combination of traits that collectively define that group of people. Now, if we scale out a little bit, if I was in class, you'd see my hands moving farther away from each other. So we're starting with that very narrow cultural trait, and now we're building out and making this on a larger scale. Cultural systems are connections of interconnected cultural complex. So these are areas with strong binding ties. I want you to think about cultural complex as if that was like Washington, D.C., and a culture system will be a lot more like looking at the United States on the whole. In fact, I think I have a map right. I'm sorry, not the United States. Excuse me, not too far yet. Oh man, do I have it? Dang it, somewhere on here. I was going to put on the perceptual regions of the U.S. There we go. So if you're going to think of it this way, like that here is D.C., that these cultural systems would be this area of the north, the Boswash corridor, right? A lot of similar characteristics to daily life here, similar businesses found in these regions. Again, we went from a cultural complex. Now we're talking about culture system, right? These are perceptual regions of the North America. These are, of course, vernacular regions, so in no way, shape, or form are we considering this fact. But we're looking again when cultures are kind of all blending together, when the practices of one area might slightly differ from another. We're talking at that scale of the culture system when we're putting those different things together. Now, when we look at very related to the culture system is just the culture region. So that's that physical area. The culture system is the idea that we've got this the connections between these cultural complexes, and the culture region is that formal or functional region in which those common characteristics prevail. So you're looking at the actual physical place there. Lastly, we end with culture realms. And culture realms is a terribly, I like the color on this one, but this one's too far. That one's too blurry. These are very large scale regions that have very generalized similarities. So you can notice, of course, the farther we get away, the larger our scale becomes here when we're looking at global culture regions. Of course, these are generalizations, that there are massive, massive differences in the culture of the people of Alaska than there are down to the people of Florida, as this first culture region would imply. However, there are still some overarching characteristics that make a culture realm have things in common. So, for example, in Latin America, if we took the Central and South America, we have the prevalence of Spanish as the language of choice, of course, with the exception of there being Brazil and a couple other smattering of different colonial powers whose languages are still spoken there. But in general, we're talking about Spanish is the prevalent language. That entire region is overwhelmingly Catholic. So we've got a linguistic, that means language connection. When we're talking about the farming practices, when we talk about some of the different dietary preferences, there are very large scale generalizations that we can make that allow us to call this region a culture realm. So you do need to be familiar with these, and these are very related to the AP your Human Geography regions that I've already had you memorize. But Anglo-American, Anglo is a reference to British, so that's a representation of the fact that the United States and Canada have historical connections to both Britain and, of course, France. We got Latin America, we have the European, and even that is a pretty broad cultural realm, because I would argue that Western Europe is very different than Eastern Europe. We have Slavic, which actually includes a lot of the Eastern European regions. We have Northern Africa is in the Islamic cultural realm, along with the Middle East, so West Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Sino-Japanese. Sino is a reference to China. Indic or India, Southeastern Asia, the Austro-European, of course, because if Australia was colonized by the British, and then insular oceanics, generally the oceanic regions. Again, culture realms are undoubtedly generalized patterns, but when we go back to this concept of just looking at culture at different scales, we're looking at how a cultural trait can build all the way up to being a defining component of a culture realm. So that's how we analyze our cultures over space, and how we regionalize those. Let's get into a little bit of the nitty gritty here. In general, cultures have hearths. Hearth, of course, is the node or is the point of origin. So cultural hearths, there's some generalized cultural hearths in the world that are deeply connected to world history. So the cultural hearth in general is a nuclear area in which a set of distinctive cultural traits, ideas, technologies develop and diffuse, just where they come from. This is an example of religious hearths for Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And you can see something we'll talk about at length about the hearths and the diffusion patterns of religions around the world. There are a few cultural hearths that are just sort of, and again, this is pretty um, generic because we're putting a lot of different cultures together when we discuss this, but traditionally the cultural hearths correspond directly with the early human civilization. So this is for those of you who, my upperclassmen, thinking throwback to the 7th grade and 9th grade curriculum, for my underclassmen a little bit closer to heart now, but we've got Mesoamerica, so we're talking about the Maya, the Aztecs, the Inca, going over there into the Andean mountain range. We're looking at the rise of the Inca. We're hopping over to West Africa, some of the early civilizations. We're talking about Ghana and Mali and their practices. See in ancient Egypt, many of you studied that in middle school. Looking over Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent, so we're talking about the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Indus River Valley, so we're looking at the Ganges and the Indus River, of course. Northern Canada, northern China. We're looking at the practices of the Huanghe and the Yangtze River valleys down in Southeast Asia. So we've got all kinds of different regions that are basically the exact same cultural hearths in the early human civilizations. But these are a lot of where our common, these are a lot of the origins of those culture realms that we were talking about before. That these are some of the basic components of human culture that is now found globally. We can also look at culture when we're defining a culture region. So where exactly is this particular culture found? So we're kind of going back. I'm just going to scale back for a second. We're going back over here to this culture system idea, this level of, okay, so what is, okay, sorry guys.